Daniel chapter 3, and beginning at verse 8, reading on to verse 25. Therefore, at that time certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. They spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery in symphony with all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar, full of rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying to them, Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I have set up? Now if you are ready at the time you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, and the psaltery in symphony with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning, fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this is the case, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury, and the expression on his face changed towards Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He spoke and commanded that they heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he commanded certain mighty men of valor who were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their trousers, their tunics, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's command was urgent, and the furnace was exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose in haste and spoke, saying to his counselors, Did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered, and they said to the king, True, O king. Look, he answered, I see 4 men, loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the form of the 4th is like the Son of God.
We've been looking at the first couple of chapters of Daniel last Sunday, and you may remember that we quickly looked at the image that was made, and that Nebuchadnezzar had a dream and he knew it was significant, but he wanted somebody to tell him the dream and also tell him the interpretation of it. And the only one who could do it was God. And God chose to share that with Daniel, and Daniel gave God the glory for what God had shown him, and Daniel went and showed the king exactly what the dream was and exactly what it meant. You may remember that Nebuchadnezzar himself featured in that dream. He was quite clearly told by God and by Daniel, he was quite clearly told that the head of that image was gold. And he was told in verse 38 of chapter 2, you are this head of gold. You are the first king, the first civilization, if you like, the first empire that has been talked about in this image. It's you, O king. But then obviously the dream went on to talk about there will be others after you. And then it told him what would be at the end. What would be at the end is God's kingdom. And that kingdom knows no end. That is the final rule of Christ. And there isn't another earthly kingdom after his. He rules over all. And his kingdom stands forever. You may remember that Nebuchadnezzar gave a good response. The Bible tells us that he fell down in worship. Absolutely lovely. There was Daniel, this Hebrew captive, and here was Nebuchadnezzar, the great king, and he was spread on his face before Daniel. And he gave God the glory. He gave God the glory. And then, at the very end of the chapter, I'll just read you the last verse of chapter 2. And Daniel petitioned the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. And Daniel sat in the gate of the king. So that is how chapter 2 came to a close. It came to a close with Nebuchadnezzar in a good place in relationship to God. And it came with Daniel's friends being promoted. The ones who had prayed with Daniel that God would give the interpretation to Nebuchadnezzar's dream. They had been promoted over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But things don't stay the same. Things change. And unfortunately, Nebuchadnezzar's heart, Nebuchadnezzar's attitude to God, it changed. I wonder if those words, "You are this head of gold," I wonder if that played any part in what we're reading in chapter 3. Isn't it strange how he's just been told by Daniel that he is a head of gold, and then the very next thing we read about that he's doing is he makes himself an image of gold. He makes an image. And we picked up the reading from verse 8, but if you look over verse 7, it mentions on 5 occasions that this image was made by Nebuchadnezzar's doing. It was an image that he had set up. And that is underlined over and over again in those first 7 verses. This is Nebuchadnezzar's idea. This is Nebuchadnezzar's image. It says in verse 1 that it was 60 cubits tall and 6 cubits wide. Measures that we're not so familiar with. Now let me give it to you in feet. The image was 90 feet high. 90 feet high. 9 feet wide. That was how big this image was that Nebuchadnezzar made. He made it of gold and it was huge. And he wanted everybody to bow down before this image. We've already seen that he's a man with a very short fuse. He's got a very fiery temper. Rage is something that we often read about with him. Obviously an issue that he was having to deal with throughout his life. Rage and pride. And he decides that if people don't bow down to this image, they're going to be thrown into fiery furnace. There's not much of a debate there, is there? You either bow down before the image, or it's the fiery furnace for you. That is what the king has decided. What about those 3 friends of Daniel then? We know that they're Jews. We know that the very first commandment that God gave to Moses, you shall not bow down before any other god. What are they going to do in this situation? Well, they do what we thought they'd do. They won't bow down. They won't bow down. When they have been made rulers over the province of Babylon, there's some people who fancy their job. Jealousy is never far from the heart of man. And there are people who see an opportunity with this. There's an opportunity to get rid of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Get rid of their influence and hopefully even take their job off them. There is obviously this element of jealousy that comes out. It is certain Chaldeans, it is people there from Babylon themselves who bring the issue before the king. Important we see that. It wasn't something that the king was aware of himself. People brought the issue to him. People who had motives. People who had designs. People who had plans. And they bring the report before the king. These people, these Jews. And then it names them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the very ones that you, Nebuchadnezzar, have put over the province of Babylon. They are refusing to bow down to your image. And again, they emphasize that this is Nebuchadnezzar's plan, this is Nebuchadnezzar's decree, and it is a challenge, as it's worded, towards his authority. And Nebuchadnezzar reacts in exactly the way that we thought he would. He acts with rage. He asks for them to be brought before him. He believes that he will be able to intimidate them. He believes that as the king of Babylon, he believes that as the man under whose command they can either go into that furnace or not, he believes that he can intimidate them to change their minds. He stands them before him, he stares them in the face, and he tells them, without any shadow of a doubt, I'll give you one more chance. One more chance. If you bow down before the idol that I have made, then you will be spared from the fiery furnace. And he then gives them a challenge. But the challenge isn't just to them. Look at the challenge that we read at the end of verse 15. If you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And here's the challenge. Who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? That's the challenge. I am king. I am ruler. We've heard about rules, haven't we? I am ruler. What I say goes. And who do you think will be able to deliver you from my hands? It's a challenge, isn't it? Who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? You're not bowing down to my image because you say you will not bow before any other God. Well, what can your God do to help you in a situation like this? And he is calling out the commitment to God. He is calling out the power of God. In spite of what he has already been told, in spite of what he has already heard and seen, it hasn't yet sunk in deep with him. It had an impact upon him for a period of time. But he is now forgotten, or he has now allowed other things to crowd in. And God has been sidelined again. And Nebuchadnezzar believes that God is not able to help them. What an incredible choice these three boys have got. We either bow down to the image or we go into that fiery furnace. The lovely thing is, they didn't need time to even think about it, did they? They have no doubts of their answer. I love the faith that they have, and I love the way that they face up to this evil choice that has been laid before them. O Nebuchadnezzar, verse 16, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God. He said, who is the God? No, he's our God. He's a personal God to them. They know him, he knows them. Our God, whom we serve. Isn't that funny? We thought they were in Nebuchadnezzar's service. We thought that Nebuchadnezzar had given them a job to rule over the province of Babylon. That is secondary. That is their secondary consideration. He is their secondary master. He might think that he is the biggest ruler in all of the world. And he is at that time. But there is a ruler above him. He's been shown that before and he's to be shown it again. Our God, whom we serve. Yes, we might be on your payroll. Yes, we might be doing your bidding. But there is another master for us. And there is another whose principles, whose commands, whose rules, whose guidance, whose leading we listen to even above yours. Our God, whom we serve. He is God, we are his servants. He is able. What a lovely response. He has asked, who is able? Who is this God who is able to deliver you? They reply, our God, he is able. We know that he is able. We have no doubts as to what God can do. He is able to deliver us from this fiery furnace. How, we do not know. But we know that if it's his desire and his will to deliver us from this, we serve a God who is able to do that. They also respond with something else. They say, he will deliver us from your hand. We will be delivered one way or another. Do not think that everything is in your hand, Nebuchadnezzar. We are all in God's hand. And God can deliver us and he will deliver us. Isn't it lovely how even when they don't know the hows, they still believe in the possibility. They still believe in the outcome, even without knowing or being able to see how that's going to happen. We often don't understand what God is doing, and we often don't foresee what God is going to do. But we can trust him. We are his servants. He is our God. He is able. Whatever we face, he is able. But look at what they say in verse 18. But if not, if not. We know that he is able and we believe that he will. But if not, there's something you need to know, O king. We will not serve your gods. Even if it costs us our very life, we will not serve your gods. And we definitely won't bow to this image that you have set up. One incredible, courageous response to this harsh choice that this angry despot of a king has laid before them. If he was angry before, how do you think he feels when his whole court has showed such courage coming from these young lads? The Bible tells us that he was already angry. It tells us that he was full of rage and fury in verse 13. It tells us in verse 19 that rage and that fury actually twists his face. You can actually see it upon him. The Bible tells us that his whole face changes. The expression on his face changes. Such insolence from these boys. He is so angry with them at the challenge against his authority that he instructs that furnace is turned up. That furnace is not left at its normal temperature. The Bible tells us that it is 7 times hotter than it normally is. There is no way that fire is not going to do what it is meant to do. It is turned up 7 times more than it normally is. But even that is not enough for Nebuchadnezzar. He then commands for mighty men of valor from his army, strong men, to come and to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He doesn't just leave this to anybody. Those 3 boys are bound tightly. So tightly. There's not going to be any way out for them. Mighty men of valor bind them up. In the clothes that they stood in, they are bound and they are cast into the very midst of this heated, fiery furnace. How do we know that his word had been listened to, that the furnace was hotter than normal? Well, the Bible tells us that flames leapt from the fire and killed the men that threw them in. So even the men that had brought up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to throw them into the fire, they perished because of the heat of the flame and the strength of the fire that they faced. And the Bible makes it very clear that when those 3 boys fell into that burning fiery furnace, they were still bound. Tightly bound, thrown into the midst of the fire. And no doubt, as Nebuchadnezzar saw them going in, He thought, this will teach everybody a lesson. You either bend to me or you suffer the consequences. If it had ended there, it would have been a mighty act of courage. But God wants to do far, far more than just give these boys a courageous end. What we read next is absolutely astonishing. King Nebuchadnezzar is astonished. We're astonished. We know the outcome of this story, but imagine how the people who were eyewitnesses to these events, imagine how they felt when all of a sudden the Bible tells us the king himself rises up in haste. He jumps up out of his chair. He is astonished at what now is unfolding before his very eyes. The Bible tells us that he turns to his counselors and he asks them a question. Have I got this right? Did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? And they answered and said to the king, true. That's true, O king. That's exactly what happened. And then he simply says, look. Look at what we see. Look at what is in front of us now. Look. I can see 4 men. 4. We threw in 3. But I can see 4. And no, not only is the number wrong, we threw them in bound. But those 4 men are loose. They're walking in the midst of the fire. They're walking around in the middle of that fire. We threw them in bound. We threw them in to perish. And there they are, as if they're out for a stroll in the midday sun. I see 4 men. They are loose. And they're walking around in the midst of this fire. And Nebuchadnezzar could see they are not hurt. They are not harmed. What an incredible God we serve. That these 3 boys being cast into the midst of this burning fiery furnace, it does them absolutely no harm at all. Who is this 4th? Who is this 4th? Nebuchadnezzar says he is in form as the Son of God. That's Nebuchadnezzar's testimony. Some commentators believe it was an angel. Personally, I believe it was Christ. I believe it was Christ who was come and was there with them, sharing with them in that trial of the fiery furnace. God provided. God helped. Nebuchadnezzar did this as a show of his strength. God turns it completely on his head. You challenge me, Nebuchadnezzar. Can I deliver? Yes, I can. And I will be there with them. You see, how often has this been our testimony as we go through life? As we go through trials that we never chose. As sometimes we go through difficulties that others have engineered for us. Does God ever leave us alone? He's always there by your side. He has promised never to leave us and never to forsake us. He doesn't just give us a guidebook and tell us to make our way. He is there walking by our side. This is the good shepherd that he is. He is always there with his flock, always there with his sheep, always there sharing in everything that we go through. We have a high priest who is touched by our infirmities. We have a high priest who understands our struggles, understands our trials, doesn't leave us to get by on our own. He is there with us every step of the way. As those boys were cast into that fiery furnace, Christ was waiting for them. He was there with them. Nebuchadnezzar is absolutely astonished at what he sees. Something that is way out of his control, something that he cannot explain, something that he does not understand. But even he begins to realize he has overstepped the mark. What's he going to do? How is he going to respond? The Bible tells us in verse 26 that he goes to the mouth of that burning fiery furnace and he asks for them to come out. But he doesn't want to see all of them. He doesn't ask for all 4 to come out. He goes to the front of that fiery furnace and he calls out to Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. He calls out to them and asks them to come out. He has no desire to meet the 4th person. He doesn't want to stand face to face with him. He calls out Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. But notice how he now addresses them. They have been cast in as worthless. They have been cast in as criminals to be punished for their insolence in not obeying the command of the king. Now the king is asking, will you please come out? And he addresses them as the servants of the Most High God. The lovely thing is that exactly the title that they had given to themselves before he threw them in. The God whom we serve. The God whom we serve. And he acknowledges that. You are servants of the Most High God. And by acknowledging that, he is acknowledging that there is a God above him. Again, he is being taught this lesson. And God is so patient with Nebuchadnezzar. He has been shown again that you might think you are the last voice of authority. You might think that you're the very top of it all. But there is one above you. There is a King of Kings. There is a Lord of Lords. He is the Most High God. He is above everything. He is above everyone. And Nebuchadnezzar has come to realize that. And he understands now who these boys are. They are servants of the Most High God. And he asks them to come out. And you can imagine the whole gathering of people that are gathering around them, who want to see these boys and how they are after coming through this trial of this incredible fiery furnace. And all of them witness exactly the same thing. It isn't just Nebuchadnezzar now. All of his administrators, all of his governors, all of his councillors, everybody of any importance is gathered there, and they have witnessed these events. And what does it tell us in verse 27? What is their testimony? What did they see? They saw these men on whose bodies the fire had no power. No power. The hair of their head was not even singed. Not even singed. Nor were their garments affected. Isn't it incredible when you stop and think? The only thing that was burnt was the rope that bound them. The rope that was bound around them, that was touching their garments, that rope was burnt. Because they were thrown in bound, but they were walking around loose. So the fire burnt the rope, but did not touch the garments on which the rope lay. None of their garments were affected at all. You couldn't even tell the scorch mark from where the rope had been. No sign at all on any of their garments that they had even been in the fire. And then this is the one that is even more incredible again. You couldn't even smell the fire on them. Couldn't smell it. Ever been around somebody who's smoking? You get home, it's on your clothes. You can't get away from it. You ever been around a bonfire and you stood at the wrong side and the wind's blowing over you? You get home, your clothes are stinking of it. Their clothes and they themselves have no residue at all about ever being in that fiery furnace. It has left no mark upon them at all. Not a hair of their head has been singed, not a single scorch mark on their clothes, and you can't even smell any fire on them at all. No wonder Nebuchadnezzar goes on to say in verse 28, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. He again acknowledges the power of what he has seen. He blesses God. The stand that these boys have made, it would have been a courageous stand if it had ended in their martyrdom. But it is far more greater than that. It is a testimony of the awesome God that they serve. And the fact that God rose to the challenge that Nebuchadnezzar threw before him. Are you able to deliver your servants? Yes, he is. He is able to deliver. Chapter 3 ended with those three boys, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. Chapter 3 ended with them being given a position of power and authority within the kingdom, within the province of Babylon. People were jealous of their jobs, people were jealous of them, and they brought a report to the king, thinking that that would be the end of them. Careful what you wish for. Look at verses 29 and 30, how chapter 3 comes to an end. Nebuchadnezzar speaking, therefore I make a decree that any people, nation or language which speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, that person will be cut into pieces and their houses shall be made an ash heap, because there is no other God who can deliver like this. There is no other God like this. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego in the province of Babylon. He gave them even more authority. How those people who had plotted against them must have gone home just shaking their heads. How can we ever fight against a God like this? Well, you can't. How can you ever outfox God? He knows everything that you're scheming, everything that you're plotting. You cannot outfox God. What do we learn from this lovely, lovely story that is often shared with children, but has so much more than just being there for children? It's there for us as adults as well, isn't it? What do we learn from this wonderful, wonderful account? We learn that there is a God in heaven. He's our God. We learn that we are his servants. We learn that he is with us through all of our trials. And even when we don't know what the outcome of the trials are going to be, we can trust in him. His plans, his purposes, his will. We can trust him. And the world around is watching. The world around is watching how God's people act. They are watching. And God's name can be glorified. God's name can be exalted through how we respond to the challenges that we face in life. And isn't it lovely how God's heart, he does deliver the boys, but if he'd allowed them to die, where would they have been? They would have been with him in heaven. And when they say, God will deliver us, I wonder if that was what was in their mind. We're going to get away from you, King, one way or the other. He'll either deliver us through the furnace, or through the furnace we'll be with him forever in heaven. I don't know exactly how they interpreted that. But we have a God who we can trust. And he has a home prepared for us. And as we go through life, he doesn't just do things to help us. He does things to help those around and about us. He wants to be known. He wants to be revealed. He wants to be seen. Not just by those who know him already, but for those who don't know him. And in the case of Nebuchadnezzar, even from those who are giving opposition to his servants, he still wants to know them. He doesn't give up on Nebuchadnezzar, you know. This is not the end of what we hear about God's dealings with Nebuchadnezzar. God is so patient with him. But it's good for us to remember that when we're going through things in life, we don't just look through the lens of how does this affect me. We understand that there is a God who has a plan for the universe. And our life is one of the strands in that plan. Our life is one of the woven fabrics into that plan. And it's not just for us. It's for others as well. It's not just how it impacts me, it's how it impacts on others as well. And it's not just that God should be my God, as great and as wonderful as that is, but he wants to be God for others as well. He wants to redeem so many more. He wants to save others. And even Nebuchadnezzar, with all of his faults, even Nebuchadnezzar with his short fuse and his quick rage and his fury, even Nebuchadnezzar is a heart that God wants to reach. Who will God reach through you? Who does God want to speak to through you? Who does God want to testify to through your life, through what you're going through? I don't know, but we can trust him. He has a plan and a purpose for everything, and he is our God, and we are his children. We are his servants.